Hi, everyone. So, for this chapter, it's kind of the last chapter in this section. We've talked about different types of research designs. We've talked about single case studies, quasi-experimental designs, and really we're going to bring it all together to briefly touch on the idea of program evaluation. So, one thing that Rubin and Babbie mention is that program evaluation is more about the purpose versus a specific type of design. So what I mean by that is program evaluation can be done through a mixture of quantitative or qualitative. It can also use things like questionnaires or focus groups, different types of data collection methods. So it's not like program evaluation comes with this tidy little research design attached to it. It's more about the idea of we are trying to evaluate a program, and so there's lots of different types of ways that we can do this. The book is great. It talks a little bit about the history of program evaluation. It's not a new thing. It also talked about, even in the modern day, the idea of managed care and how that's put a lot of pressure on making sure that we're using money effectively and that we're not just throwing a bunch of interventions at someone hoping something sticks. We really want to make sure that we are using our resources and client or insurance company finances effectively. And when you tie that into the idea of evidence-based practice, if we're saying that social workers are called to use evidence-based practices and understand what that looks like, that means that we need to also be evaluating programs to make sure that we're implementing interventions correctly. So the book focuses on some of the techniques that we need to make sure program evaluation is done effectively, because it also costs money and takes time and could potentially take time away from practitioners. So we want to make sure that we're doing it effectively. And one way we can do this is by conceptualizing the organization. When we're talking about a single subject design, we're looking at things like one specific behavior and we're really narrowing it down, a score on a test or frequency of the number of times someone has a behavior. But when you think about programs, they're huge. You could be looking at a state program, you could be looking at a program to address individuals who are unhoused and all the different facets of it. And so one way that we can start to create this strong overview of the program so we know exactly what to evaluate, how to evaluate it, is through the use of a logic model. And the book does a really nice job of giving some great examples in this chapter of different types of logic models, so I'm not going to go into depth on each one. They're great because they really allow us to map the issue and include it in our evaluation proposal. What we're doing is, based on the logic model we choose, we're looking at things like what are the elements or relationships between resources, activities, outputs, outcomes, and our final goal. Are we impacting the community positively? If our thing is focusing on suicide prevention, are we seeing a decrease in the number of suicides in our community? So we're really looking at all of these different elements. So there are three different types that the book references. The first is a theory-based logic model. So that is really going to the heart of what we do. It's starting with the assumptions based on theories and principles. So if you're looking at something like homelessness in a community, you're really looking at the theories and principles that might drive it. And in the book, they have a really nice diagram showing the different theories and assumptions that they use as kind of the basis of the logic model. Then what you do is, based on those theories and assumptions about how we should address a problem, you look in the activities. What are the activities that are being done through this organization that are honoring those principles? So for example, if we say that one of our assumptions and principles is focused on the idea of client self-determination and sustainability, then do our activities match if all of our activities are we tell clients what to do? Not necessarily. That's not really helping them with sustainability. So we look at those theories, we look at the principles, we look at the activities used to address it. We look at a series of outcomes, right? What are the immediate outcomes and what are the intermediate outcomes? And then what is the final goal? It also references the outcomes approach, which focuses less on theory and more on the outcomes. What do you want to happen? What is this program actually doing? And so you might start with the resources or inputs, as they refer to it, that you need. What are the resources in the community? What are the different financial resources that you need? Then when we put those in and we look at our activities, what are the short-term and long-term objectives that the organization wants to achieve, and what is the final impact or goal or outcome? Then the third type is an activities approach, and this really focuses less on the inputs and focuses less on theory. It really focuses on what are the activities this program needs to do to be able to meet those objectives and long-term outcomes. So slightly different focuses, but logic models are great, and Rubin and Babbie talk about the value they bring to a research proposal or an evaluation proposal, because it really shows you understand what the organization is doing doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and you can then go through and figure out what to evaluate and do it more effectively. And it allows you to do a more effective evaluation instead of just showing up and saying, hey, I'm here, what do I need to evaluate? The book also talks about the purposes of program evaluation, and there's 3 different types. One is you can assess the success of a program. Is it working? If our mission statement is we're going to reduce recidivism in our community from men and women exiting the jail system, is it working? Are we supporting those individuals? Do they have outcomes? Like if we say that we're going to make sure that we are supporting them so that they can all get jobs, then we can look and say, did all the people being released from jail going through your program get jobs? It's very clear, like, is the program successful? Is it doing what it needs to do? Another purpose you can do is to assess how our program is being implemented, and is it effectively being implemented? A lot of organizations spend large amounts of money or grant money on these really great, well-structured, evidence-based programs, but are they implementing it? Are your practitioners using the intervention the way that they should? So we want to see, how is a program being implemented? Is it being done at the beginning of this process? Are we going halfway in and saying the organization's been around 5 years, but we're not really sure if they're actually implementing the program the way they said they would? So we're really looking at those elements. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about needs assessments and the idea that sometimes we just need information for program planning and development. There are also 2 types of evaluations. So we can do a summative evaluation or a formative evaluation. And we talk a lot about this in learning as well. A summative evaluation might be that course evaluation at the very end of the semester where students assess the entire 16 weeks and what that looks like. Or you can do a formative evaluation, which is halfway through the semester. Your instructor says, hey, what's working and what's not. And so with summative evaluations, we're really focusing on those results and outcomes, which matches really nice that idea of assessing the success of a program. Formative evaluations are great because they can be more focused on how programs are being implemented or what is the need in the community. They're really focused on process. It's coming in halfway through and saying, hey, let's interview people involved. Let's use qualitative research methods in addition to quantitative. Whereas a summative evaluation might focus more on kind of the numbers, the outcomes, percentages, and then some recommendations. A formative evaluation, we looked at the numbers, but man, we also interviewed all of the practitioners in your clinic and the clients they serve to create this idea of, is it a smooth process? Are things being done effectively and with fidelity to the intervention that they've selected? So finally, the book ties it all together, talking about different program evaluation types. So sometimes you're just doing an outcomes and efficiency evaluation. We're asking the questions of, is the program attaining the goals they want to attain, right? That logic model is great because it's going to show you what their final short-term, long-term objectives and final goal is. And you can say, are they meeting that? We can see if there's any harmful effects on the community, on the clients, on the individuals. And there's 2 different types. We can look at a cost effectiveness evaluation, which is simply looking at numbers and use of numbers, use of money, assigning an amount per dollar per head of client, that kind of thing. Or we can do what's called a cost benefit evaluation. And these are really important because a lot of the work we do in social work isn't always super quantifiable when it comes to money. For example, if I'm running a suicide prevention program, it can be harder to measure things like people who might have attempted suicide but didn't. We can look at overall numbers, but it's really hard to quantify the benefit, but maybe it does have a benefit we're just not aware of. So cost benefit analysis looks at that cost effectiveness, but also says, are there benefits that maybe aren't financial, but are still good for the community or good for the clients in the organization? There's a couple of challenges with an outcomes and efficiency evaluation. It can be really hard to operationalize goals. Sometimes goals change, organizations change, missions can change. We also want to look at increasing internal validity. And if we're only looking at point A, the very beginning of a program, and point B, which are the final results, how do we know that the changes weren't related to something like history or maturation, right? Those same threats to internal validity we talked about with other types of research designs could absolutely apply here. You might say, look, the intervention is causing a decrease in homelessness in our community, but what if it's an external factor? What if it's the economy is changing and that is creating a difference? Is it really the intervention or is it an external issue? So we really have to focus on increasing that internal validity. And sometimes if we focus on the outcomes, the numbers, do we miss the process. So maybe we look and our overall goal is being met, our numbers are being reduced in some way, but our turnover is 60% because we're burning out our practitioners, or we're ruining those community bridges that we need. So you might look at the outcomes and say the numbers look great, but man, at the expense of our community or expense of relationships or the expense of our clinicians. These are nice. You can look at the end goal and say, are they doing what they need to do? It doesn't always control for threats to internal validity, and it doesn't always necessarily capture the process of the intervention or of the program. So when we feel like the outcome measurements may not be quite enough, we can do something like a program implementation evaluation. So this is really looking not just at the outcomes at the end, but we're looking in the interim, the middle part. Who is being helped? How are they being helped? How are things being implemented? Is this a brand new program? Is it something where it's a new approach that's being introduced? It's obviously a challenge when you have large organizations. We have turnover issues, administration issues, the communities change, and so sometimes that can change how programs become implemented. And so this is a good way to say not just the outcomes, but what is happening in the interim, what is happening in the process. We also want to look at how interventions are being administered. This is that term we talked about earlier about fidelity outcomes. How close to the original intention of the intervention or program are we doing? Or is it something where the organization says, hey, we use this approach, but everybody kind of implements it willy-nilly the way they want to do it, and so it's not really being used to fidelity. So we're looking at that. Going deeper, you can have a similar type of evaluation, which is called a process evaluation. And this is also not just looking at how the program is being implemented, but it's really looking at strengths and weaknesses and processes. So if you've ever started a job and you've had to do like an onboarding and it's all over the place and you don't know what needs to be done, you could say at the end, oh, look, you got onboarded, but man, the process in the middle was stressful. You didn't know who to contact. The trainings didn't make sense together. You can have strengths and weaknesses in how things are administered as well. And that can be really important to look at. Process evaluations are great too because they really look at the process of the program and then create some tangible recommendation. So I'm thinking of one we had locally where a consulting agency came in and looked at a major system in our state. And at the end, they said, here's the strengths, here's the weaknesses, and here's our recommendations. Your current electronic health record is not working for you, and here's why. Here's what we recommend for a new one. So it has some tangible recommendations. It also often has a qualitative element of interviews or focus groups with individuals being helped, people within the organization, maybe looking at leadership. So really saying not just, is it being implemented effectively, but what is the process of implementation and is that effective in its own way? The book also talks a little about in-house versus external evaluators and the benefits and challenges of both. For example, if you have an in-house evaluator, so someone who works for the organization and does this kind of evaluation, they're great, they're involved, they know the leadership, they might have that buy-in already to interview employees, but then they might be inclined to not share unflattering results because they work for the organization, they're invested in it, and maybe even their job's dependent on it. But the book also references the idea that external evaluators, we might assume they're more objective, but they're also vulnerable to pressure to make things look good. Finally, the third type of evaluation we can do when we're looking at program planning or development is a needs assessment evaluation. And I'm not going to linger on this too much because I know you all are doing this in some of your other classes, but the book references 5 different types of needs assessments. The first is the idea of a key informants approach. So this might be looking at key informants in that community or working with that population. Leaders, people working in organizations, CEOs, boards, that kind of thing. And you might give surveys or questionnaires to those leaders, community involved people to get information about what the need is. If this is quick, it's easy. You can create a quick survey or quick questionnaire and send it out to the leaders you've identified. But one of the limitations is it doesn't always survey the population of people you want to help. It's just the leaders who are working with the issue. So they may not always be fully in touch. The second type is a community forum approach. Open meetings where community members have the opportunity to come in and share. This is great. It can build community and build support from the community because they feel engaged and involved, but it may not be representative. I always think of Yelp and Google reviews, right? People tend to share when they feel really strongly about something. So the only people that might show up for the community forum are people that feel strongly on both sides of the issue, but the majority who are kind of neutral, they're not necessarily going to come. So it may not be representative of the issue. The third type is the rates under treatment approach. So this is where we estimate the need for something based on existing clients and client use of programs. So this can be a secondary analysis looking at records. We might say, okay, well, last year schools reported that they had this many students struggling with truancy. So we are going to make some assumptions that maybe next year that same amount of students may experience truancy. One of the challenges, as well as this quick and easy and you're often using existing records. The challenge is it's only focusing on people already using the system or biased records. So maybe a school didn't want to mark students as truant even though the students weren't there. Or maybe we're only looking at students experiencing truancy, but it doesn't capture the fact that maybe there's 10% of our district where students aren't even going to school at all. They're off the record, they're off the radar, so we're not really measuring how many students are struggling with not being in school. Finally, the remaining two are the social indicators approach. So this is looking at the whole population's conditions, not just those in treatment. There's a lot of great tools and community assessments where people go in and they look at indicators, let's say of health indicators, the number of people struggling with obesity, the number of people smoking in a community, and then using those numbers, they can start to focus on what is the issue here. Maybe in our community, we have a really high number of people who have diabetes, but we don't have a lot of treatment centers or options for them. Well, we can look at the population as a whole in our community and make some guesses. It's nice, it's unobtrusive and quick, but the challenge is it really gives us some problems with reliability. If we replicated this over and over, are we going to find similar results? And do current indicators predict future behaviors? We don't always know that. Finally, there is the community survey approach, which is where we go in and we actually survey members of the target group. There's some really great research articles I've read where they went in and interviewed moms who were receiving taffy assistance and interviewed them to see, is this helpful? How does it affect your life? Instead of interviewing the people who administer it, they ask the people receiving it. And this is a great approach. It really allows a voice for our clients, but it can involve sampling. How do we measure all of the people in a community? We can't. And so it's also really vulnerable to things like bias and measurement challenges. So all of these needs assessment evaluations, different approaches, but really help us identify what is the need, how do we fill it, and what do the people in that community think about it. So that's program evaluation in a nutshell. So here's my references. I hope it was helpful. Thanks.